Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to Mythic Mission with Professor Michael Jahosky. Believe it or not, this is episode number 9 already. And I'm entitling this one Cultural Apologetics and Myth with Dr. Paul Gould, who's joining me today. And Dr. Gould is an associate professor of philosophy of religion and director of the MA Philosophy of Religion program at Palm Beach Atlantic University. Gould earned his doctorate in philosophy from Purdue University. He is the author or editor of 10 scholarly and popular level books, including Cultural Apologetics, which we'll be talking about today, Philosophy, A Christian Introduction, and The Story of the Cosmos. He has been a visiting scholar at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School's Henry Center, working at the intersection of science and faith, and is the founder and president of the Two Tasks Institute. He is a widely sought after speaker in apologetics and philosophy, speaks regularly at universities, churches, and ministries around the country, including Summit Ministries, the C.S. Lewis Institute, and the Evangelical Philosophical Society's annual Apologetics Conference. He's married to Ethel and has 4 children. So, Paul, I'm so happy to have you on the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Mike. It's good to be here with you.
Yeah. I've been looking forward to this one, and I told people we're having Paul Gould on the show, and they're like, "Oh, I got to listen to that one." So they're all primed and ready to go.
I'll do my best.
I know. Yeah. Well, this is such an important topic, and I know you know personally. For me, it's one that has changed my way of looking at things. So I hope that we'll be able to give people at the beginning of the week something powerful to think about, especially in this day and age. So,
Great.
Yeah, so I think we'll just start off with, if you don't mind, just telling us your story about how you became a Christian, and did Lewis or Tolkien have anything to do with that? If not, obviously that's okay. Any influence that they may or may not have had?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's a great question. Always happy to share in terms my story. But I grew up sort of nominally in a religious background, a religious home. We went to church, not just Easter and Christmas, but it wasn't sort of central to our life. And I can remember going to undergraduate college, and there was a couple of guys that knocked on my door, and they basically asked me, if I was interested in spiritual things, and the answer was yeah, sure, why not? And they wanted to know if I wanted to hear, some more about that. And so they basically began to share the gospel. And I can remember when they shared, again, as a freshman, first of all, why were these guys, they seem like normal college students. Why were they so into God? I mean, aren't we here in college to party and to have fun and, to get good grades, of course, too.
Yeah.
But it just really rattled me when they shared, because they concisely shared the gospel and sort of brought you to that realization that, you need to make this personal decision for Christ. And that was something that I hadn't done. I just thought, going to church was sufficient and that I was good. And so anyway, that began a journey, because the question that sort of was left lingering after they had finally left was, what if this is true? Like, what if the gospel is actually true and Christianity is actually true? And so I actually, there's another friend of mine who was in the dorm. He had already identified himself as a Christian. His name was Mike. And he said, "Hey, I'm a Christian. I'm not going to judge you when you get drunk, but just want to let you know." And I was like, "Okay, that's cool." Never had thought about it that way, but great. So I went to Mike and that year, and we talked, and we eventually began to go to an apologetics class, which I now know is not normal as a non-believer, but I would go every week with Mike to this apologetics class. And every week there'd be a professor there that had a stack of books on, the historicity of the Gospels or the resurrection of Christ, or, whatever it was. And I was just fascinated with the fact that there was evidence and reasons. And, this question, again, what if it's true, continued to sort of linger in my mind.
Yeah.
And basically, and then I'd come and they'd ask me questions like, "What do you think?" And I'd say, "Well, it's impressive, the evidence." And they would press me again. "Well, at some point you need to make a decision." And I'm like, "Yeah, I know." Anyway, so that went on the whole first year. And then basically I was back at home. I went to school in Ohio at Miami University. I was back at home in Milwaukee. And I was reading the Bible at that time, really, I think, seeking these things. And I was reading Revelation, actually, and it was just kind of had this moment sitting on my back porch thinking, you know what? maybe I shouldn't wait till after college to fit God back into my life. I think I'd realized in my mind that it was true. And then
Mm,
it was just a battle for my heart and really a moral issue at the time. And so,
mhm.
long story short, I think I became convinced, not that it was true, but it was the right thing to do. So I bent my knee and placed my faith in Christ and sort of
Mm.
jumped right back into the ministry,
Wow.
and began to grow from there. The Campus Crusade for Christ, or Cru, was the ministry that these students were a part of.
Yeah.
In terms of
Yeah.
Lewis and
Mhm.
Tolkien, that influence was later.
Mhm.
I was
Mhm.
exposed to them a little bit, but I think it was later as I began to do evangelism and do apologetics, and then began to read Lewis, and then have kids and start to read Narnia again,
Sure.
and the Middle Earth tales again. That's
Mhm.
when I began to realize, okay, wait a minute, there's something really special here with these guys. So anyway, quick, we can talk
Yeah.
more about it, but that's, I
Yeah,
think.
no, that's great. I'd never heard the story myself from you, so that was great to hear. A couple of things just came to mind. I've heard from folks we've had on the show and just colleagues. Some people, Lewis and Tolkien was either very instrumental to their faith, or they discovered them after they kind of discovered the rudimentary basics of their faith, or kind of made that commitment, and then it started to impact them and open up new vistas. So I've heard it both ways. So that's it's not like it's a necessity, but of course I know how influential these authors have been in bringing people to Christ, which is very powerful. So we'll be talking more about myths or stories later, and what role the imagination may or may not play in that. I lost my other thought, but it'll come back to me, I'm sure. Oh, yeah, I think it was Scott McKnight. I read a book some years ago. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work, but he wrote something that impacted me. I had never heard somebody put it quite this way, but and I'm not saying this is true of your story, but many Christian apologists today, and I think you kind of hinted this in your early chapters, are trying to appeal to reason and think that we can argue our way into people's lives and get them to make that decision. And he said something like, sometimes the church is more focused on getting converts than making disciples. And I don't know, I get a sense from reading Cultural Apologetics that, you value the rational. Obviously, you can't be a Christian without it, but you almost seem to suggest that we might be over relying on it sometimes. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, well, yeah.
Reason.
So I would want to avoid like a sort of a false dichotomy of either
Yeah,
or. I mean, I
of
think it's
course.
a both and,
I do
reason
too.
and romance, as Lewis would put it.
Yeah.
Both sides of the hemispheres of the mind and the heart.
Hmm.
Um, but one of the surprises of writing the book. So I wrote the book Cultural Apologetics, wrestling with this question: how does the gospel get a fair hearing in culture? So thinking about non-believers. But one of the surprises of the book was how relevant it is for discipleship and for my own spiritual formation and for our own spiritual formation. And so, in
Yeah.
many ways, and it's been interesting, like the people that have been benefiting from the book are not just those interested in evangelism, but a lot of
Mm,
people that are preachers or do missions or do, discipleship ministries are finding the book
that's
helpful. And
great.
so that was kind of an interesting surprise. But,
Yeah.
and we can, again, keep talking about this, but it
Yeah.
set
Yeah.
me on this journey. you know, if we need to join with God to re-enchant the world, and we can explain that in a minute, and
Sure.
we do that by learning to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does, like
Mm,
that's about us before
mm,
we can invite others to see and delight in the world the way Jesus is. So yeah, that was actually one of the big surprises. And I
that's
think for
great.
me, even as a young believer, I had grown up in the church somewhat, and I didn't want that. Like I knew that it was either an all or nothing. Like I'm either
Yeah.
all in, and it's something that you give your whole life to, or or it's not true and just discard it. Like don't do
Yeah.
this middle ground. And so for me, it's always been so. Yeah, it's no surprise that it came out that way in the book, given the questions that I'm asking are questions
Sure.
that are just as much questions that we need to be thinking about as Christians as.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I completely agree with you. We don't want to fall into that false dichotomy. It's not mythos or logos. It's both, and we need to appeal to both sides, as you said. So I totally agree with you. I just think sometimes I think I burned out on the logo side for my first many years of, well, I would say maybe 4 or 5 years of doing apologetics and teaching, and I've just realized we really need to appeal to that hunger in the heart and to the center of the person, their loves and affections, not just their mind, well, that part of their mind, the rational side. So yeah, we'll get back into it. I just wanted to see your take on that. So that's great. And we do need, this is not just for new believers. This is for Christians who are looking to just kind of deepen their discipleship. And as you said, to see the world the way that Jesus did, sacramentally. So let's get into that. I think probably best to talk about disenchantment first and how you understand that. I know one thing I just have to say, if I haven't told you this already, I probably did, but the graphics in the book, Cultural Apologetics, are tremendous. I mean, people would hear me because I taught a class at church on your book a year or so ago, I think now, and they heard it and they're like, "Oh yeah, that makes sense." And then you showed them the model, and it's like, "Okay, that makes perfect sense." So disenchantment, I suppose, what is it? And then we can get into some causes of it and remedies and branch off from there.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So disenchantment is part of the, like one of the things I argue is the first step as cultural apologists, those who want to have a conversation with culture, is we've got to understand the culture we find ourselves in. And so disenchantment is a word that I think describes the dominant way of perceiving in our world. We perceive in this disenchanted way, and theologians actually are use this language and talk about it as an idolatrous way of perceiving, which is really interesting. But for me, I think it's similar to Charles Taylor, who's a Catholic philosopher. He wrote a mammoth book called, A Secular Age.
Yeah.
And there he kind of defines different senses of secular. And the last one is the one that he lands on is this idea that a secular age is an age of contested belief, where belief in God is not automatic. And it's for believers, it's even difficult. And the language I use is disenchantment, but it's the idea that the world has been emptied of its divine, that we no longer see the world in its proper light. And so often as Christians, I mean, you already said it earlier about this, you use the word sacramental. So often as Christians, we'll describe the world the same way everyone else does, right? We'll use words like mundane or ordinary or everyday.
Yep.
But that's not the way the world is, right? In reality, the world is deeply mysterious and enchanted. To use the proper word, it would be sacred or holy, as Lewis discovered.
Yep.
And so when I say the dominant way of describing the world is one of disenchantment, I just mean it's been emptied of our magic. And so the dominant characteristics are things like the felt absence of God. People just don't feel God around, which leads pretty quickly to the commoditization of everything. People and things are commoditized. It leads to this sort of idolatry run amok and foolishness run amok. But basically, it's a kind of perceiving where we just don't see things the way they are.
And it just, that's perfect. It's a great summary. It just reminded me of something from your book. It might be in that section, I think it's chapter 2, about when we argue or make a case for the gospel, or whether we do it through kind of mythos or logos or kind of a combination, some people are going to be faced with this decision. And I forget how you put it exactly, but it's, they'll respond something like, well, I need more proof. I need more evidence. And I think your point is that, even if there was enough evidence, for some people, it's not going to be enough. And I think here you were talking about reason, and this kind of displays that it's a hard issue, is that even if I could give you the perfect archaeological, historical, rational, empirical, materialistic evidence, which is what every, disenchanted modern person wants, it still may not be enough to prove, it's just not enough. And so it's a hard issue. And then you also mentioned, and just so you can comment on this, don't you mention that there are false enchantments as well? And I know we haven't gotten to enchantment yet, but there are, because I know I've seen some people respond to you and say, oh, well, I think the world is enchanted. I wouldn't say it's disenchanted. And I've seen, you respond that, no, that's not what I mean. It is disenchanted, but there are some people who look at it enchanted, but it's a false kind of enchantment. I think that's a good
There's this
distinction.
great book by one of my favorite, becoming one of my favorite authors named Paul Tyson. He just wrote a book called 7 Brief Lessons on Magic. And one of the chapter titles to the book is the world. One chapter is the world is definitely disenchanted. And then the next chapter is the world is definitely not disenchanted. And that's exactly what I would want to say. Yeah. And I think, so we're using this in different senses. So it's true that the intelligentsia tell us there's nothing beyond this world. We live in the immanent frame, as Charles Taylor would put it, the mundane. But what's so interesting is that our longings, this is where myth and story and things are so important, our longings betray us, right? Like we're told that that there's nothing beyond this world, yet we spend all of our time, in watching movies that have something beyond the mundane, whether it's vampires or zombies or little mythical creatures, playing some game, Pokemon Go or whatever, or the obsession with the paranormal. There's books out there about the strange rights of humans, where we're told that God doesn't exist, but we're involved in all these just crazy groups online that are all about something beyond this world. And so in that sense, no, the world is disenchanted. We don't see it the way it is. We think it's been emptied of her magic, but it is enchanted, especially in in our imagination and in our longings, because we long for more. And I think, and the point is, yeah, there can be false re-enchantments where we follow the deep longing of the heart for something beyond this world and then locate it in something that's not the good, the true, and the beautiful.
Right.
And also, I would want to say that longing, these longings of the heart that stir so much on the imaginative side, I think are clues, to the way the world is, and we should follow those clues.
Yep.
And that's this idea of, that's why story is going to be so important. We can follow these clues to their author, which I actually think is, is the God of the Bible.
Sure. And I agree. And there, I think you leave, from the argument from desire, a valuable door open to then argue the rational and the historical, to say, okay, well, this could point to any number of conceptions of God, even within Hinduism. I mean, you have, an assortment of different definitions of God, but this is why it points to this conception, this Judeo-Christian conception of God that we want to emphasize. So yeah, that's great. And I got to check out that book. You said, was it Paul Tyson?
Yeah, Paul Tyson,
Okay,
3 books that I would recommend by him. The latest one is called 7 Brief Lessons on Magic. Prior to that, he's written a book called Defragmenting Modernity. And then one before that, which I have footnoted and referenced in the Cultural Apologetics book, is called Return to Reality. He's a kind of Christian Platonist. This is why I'm interested in Lewis as well. I don't actually agree with all the ways that he lands on things, but he's helping us, I think, to see the way the world is in its proper light with these sacramental eyes. I think that's part of the Christian Platonism that I'm interested in, that Lewis and Tolkien are interested in as well. Anyway, so that's who that is.
I've got to ask now, though, because when I was writing my book, I had a hard time trying to say, no, Christianity is dualistic, but it's kind of a historical dualism that and I'm, of course, borrowing from N.T. Wright here, who talks about the Olam Hazah and the Olam Haba, and this age versus the age to come, not so much an up and down, the Platonic sense. So I want to ask you, if I can squeeze this in here, about Christian Platonism. Could you speak to that just for a minute or two?
Yeah, I work in metaphysics, which is the subdiscipline in philosophy that is really interested in the nature and structure of reality. And there I do defend when it comes, so I'm going to give you 2 answers. When it comes to abstract objects, I am decidedly a Platonist in that I think that abstract objects exist. So one way that you could cash out what I mean by Christian Platonism, this isn't Lewis, this is why I need to give you a 2-part answer. Please. One way is someone who's a Christian, who believes God exists, that also believes that there's an abstract realm that exists. So we might call that contemporary Christian Platonism with respect to abstract objects. So in that sense, I am a Christian Platonist. So I'm interested in how the world fits together. And I think there's the concrete universe, the things located in space and time. And then there's all this other stuff that are called abstract objects. Think of Platonic forms, we update, but it's basically that view. So it is dualistic in that sense, that there's a concrete realm and an abstract realm. Now come back to Lewis and what exactly am I thinking though beyond that? I think there's a kind of Christian Platonism that Lewis, Tolkien even would be interested in, that views the world as a sacrament, where the God is ontologically distinct from this world, yet he participates in this world. And there's this participatory, this sacramental relation between the world, such that universe. So now I'm not talking about the abstract realm, but I'm talking about the physical thing, the universe, the concrete thing. That thing too is best characterized as a sacramental universe. And what that means, actually, there's this great essay by William Temple, teaching on it this week in one of my classes. It's actually chapter 19 in his book, God, Man, and Nature, I think, but it was lecture 19 in the Gifford lectures that he did in 1933 and 34. His lecture was entitled The Sacramental Universe, and he kind of unpacks it, and I think brings this notion of a sacramental universe back into the modern discussion. But there, he defines a sacramental universe. So now we're talking, it's an adjective to describe the universe in 2 ways. A sacramental universe functions semiotically, and that's just a fancy word for it's a sign, it points. So the physical stuff points to deeper spiritual truths. That's the word semiotic. And then number 2, participatory, where God participates in the universe participates in some sense in God. And that is what Tolkien and Lewis were interested in, and I'm also very interested in that. And so the kind of Platonism that theologians, like even N.T. Wright does this, I think he's somewhat mistaken, but the
Mm,
theologians who denigrate Platonism and say
mm,
that's sort of a boogeyman, well, what they mean, they're just focused on traditional Platonism and the denigration of the body, which is
mm.
present in sort of traditional Platonism. That's not what I mean. That's not what Lewis meant. It's not what contemporary Christian Platonists would mean. It would be something
Wow.
much richer that would also affirm the body, the embodiment, the materiality, but just link it in the ways that I've tried to.
That's actually very enlightening what you said, and I'm glad you're pushing back on Wright's theology there, because I've always wondered if it's more theology of the body, and that it's more that that's the issue that he's had. And I haven't read my Plato in a while, sat down and formally read it, but I don't. I mean, I know there's a somewhat of a denigration of the physical realm,
Oh
but
yeah, very
I
much
don't,
so. Mhm.
yeah, I don't think that Lewis and Tolkien, though, were otherworldly and disembodied. I think that you could read them that way very easily, especially Lewis and Mere Christianity talking about our true country. We mustn't let it get snowed under. But you could also think of a country over there horizontally, that it's still, the transcendent is still located here, but it is ontologically separate and distinct. So I don't see why it has to be up and disembodied, and maybe it's a caricature that people have of Plato, and also of what they think Lewis and Tolkien meant by Platonism, excuse me. So
Yeah, I mean, it's understandable, so
yeah.
even in this book, I'm contributing to like a 4 views on Christian metaphysics book, and
Oh,
I'm the
cool.
Christian Platonist view.
Mm-hmm.
And so even there, I have to distinguish like a taxonomy of Platonisms, and so
Good.
and then set aside the ones that I'm not interested in. And so I think
Excellent.
rightly so, if we're just talking about, which is a lot of times what theologians will harp on is the bad stuff, the kind of Gnostic trend in
Mm,
traditional Platonism. I mean, there's other things too, the eternality of the souls and things like that, we would want to reject that, of course.
mm-hmm.
Lewis knew that, Tolkien knew that, of course they
Yeah.
know that
Yeah.
that's not what they're after.
I
So you just
agree.
have to kind of be clear, define what parts of it you're pulling from the tradition and which ones you're not. But I do think it's kind of that there's lots more to this world than just the physical stuff. That's one basic takeaway,
Yeah.
and they're deeply connected, right? The
Yeah.
two fundamental things are God and the world, and then there's this relation between them, right? That's the
Mm,
most fundamental fact, and each one of those pieces, I think Platonism ties them together in this tight sacramental whole. And what's so interesting, again, I know we're not even going to talk about this, but like there's this huge movement within theology to recapture what they would call the sacramental image of the world.
mm,
And I've been reading the literature, especially last year when I was at Trinity. I was doing the visiting scholar stuff there, and I read a lot of the literature from theologians trying to recapture the great tradition and the sacramental view of the world. And I think that there's a lot of ways that philosophers need to enter into that discussion because we can help with some of the precision in language. I mean, they're recapturing and throwing words out like sacramental and participatory and
mm,
analogy of being and all these things, but they're not using them in the same way. And it's just, there's some unclarity there. And I think philosophers can help. But if they're right, and the world is a sacramental universe, well, I think also that's something that philosophers need to think about, contemporary Christian
mhm.
philosophers who are
Agreed.
captured by this sort of neo-Humean zeitgeist of the
Yeah.
age. Well, maybe we, need a little renewal, and that's something that I'm pretty interested in.
Yeah, and it would make sense if we did that this would be a good direction to go in. And I really love the idea of taxonomies of Platonism, that I think is very, very crucial. We don't see, I mean, I haven't seen, I guess I should speak for everybody here. I have not encountered that kind of idea
Right.
and nuance, which is very needed, because I sense it underneath some things that I read, but nobody's explicitly identified it. So I look forward to reading that. Is that a future project
Yeah,
that you're
it's
contributing?
a project that's currently underway.
Ah,
4 views on Christian metaphysics.
oh,
We're
it,
in the responding to each other's essays stage.
oh, okay.
It'll be
So
a
it's,
while. We're writing it right now.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's that Zondervan series, I think, right? Or
No,
is it?
this one's going to be with Cascade, but
Oh,
it's
oh,
kind of idea, multi-view books. Yeah. Yeah.
excellent, excellent. Okay, well, I could go down the rabbit hole with you on that because there's more questions, but I'll move on to re-enchantment. So we talked about disenchantment and also sort of the different perceptions of disenchantment. So the need, of course, is to re-enchant, and this is well, of course, what you bring out, and this is ebook page number, but page 111. You talk later about Tolkien's role in cleaning our windows and
Mhm.
restoring that sacramental, tight-knit view of the universe, which will also bring us to myth later. But for now, just talk about re-enchantment and what you see that meaning in your book, Cultural Apologetics.
Yeah. So what was so interesting, again, reading, studying for the book, teaching over the years, as you begin to read, like especially the ancient literature. So think of Augustine,
Mhm.
and then keep fast forward through Boethius and then Aquinas and Anselm, all the way to Lewis and Tolkien. What you see is this pattern of thinking about reality in terms of, to speak with the learned, the Latin, exodus redditus, right?
Yeah.
Wander from God and return to God. So this is kind of
Yeah.
it's actually a very Neoplatonic or Platonic way of viewing the world. Everything's from God, and then, it kind of moves back to God. And of course, humans created in the divine image are kind of the hinge of the universe, that we receive all these things from God as gift. And then and then as these priests and priestesses, or as Lewis would say, these kings and queens
Mm.
of the world, right? That we re-gift them back to God. And so this re-gifting back to God is this idea of re-enchantment. So we have disenchantment and then re-enchantment.
Beautiful.
And so the idea in the book, basically, I just to give it a little pithy phrase, and this actually comes from Paul Tyson, since we mentioned it. The title of his book, Return to Reality. I
Mm.
think we return to reality by doing two things. We, number one, learn to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. So that's something about us, claim about us.
Yeah.
And number two, then we begin to invite others to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And that's how we can, with the Lord's help, with each other and the power of the Holy Spirit, maybe we can begin to re-enchant the world. This is the more hopeful part of the Cultural Apologetics book.
Yeah.
That given God's intentions for humans, that he wants all people to know him, that
Yep.
maybe something like re-enchantment is possible. So that's a little bit of what's going on there.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and it's been such a blessing to me being at a secular college on the other side of the state. Paul's in Florida alongside me here, so we're on opposite ends, and we are. I guess some of the Christian faculty I work with, I can speak for them. We're seeing a lot of disenchantment, and this is a very helpful model for trying to bring Christ into this kind of environment. Of course, one has to do so respectfully and tactfully, but it's particularly helpful for being at a secular school.
Good.
So, and of course we need it. I mean, of course, it's such an overlooked thing today, but we're seeing more and more that Christians, even people within Christian school, Christians are doubting and needing help and wanting to ask important questions. So, again, it's not an either or. Before we go any further, I probably should have asked you this earlier, but could you summarize cultural apologetics, and then we'll talk maybe about some strategies before getting into the imagination and all that stuff.
Okay. Yeah. Really
Yeah.
simply, the definition I land on in the book is that cultural apologetics is working to renew the Christian voice, the Christian conscience, and the Christian imagination, so that Christianity will be seen as true and satisfying. In other words, that in evangelism and in apologetics, we don't just want to show that Christianity is true to the way the world is. I mean, we have to, right? We want to show that
Yeah.
it's reasonable. That's the plausible or reasonable side. But we also want to show that it's true to the way the world ought to be. In other words, that Christianity is not just true, but good and beautiful as well, that it satisfies the deep longings of the human heart. And then the last thing I'll say, if you notice, working to renew the voice, the conscience, and the imagination. I spent a good bit of time, probably could have spent a lot more time arguing that we kind of have this image problem where, people don't want to hear from us. So we've lost the Christian voice in culture, right? We just, nobody cares what you have to say because we're not plausible. We live just as fragmented lives as non-believers. And so we've lost our prophetic voice. And so the Christian conscience has been lost. So that's why we need to renew that.
Yeah.
And then the idea of we don't see the world any different than anybody else. We've lost the Christian imagination. So that's why we need to renew that as well. So that's
beautiful.
Sort of working definition.
Yeah, no, that's great. And this leads me, so for listeners and I guess viewers as well, I'm working from the ebook edition of Cultural Apologetics, page 21. You mentioned Niebuhr's 5 models. For those of you that are not familiar, Niebuhr had 5 models of engaging Christ in culture. I think it's Christ against, Christ above, and I don't remember all of these in every detail. Christ of culture, Christ in paradox with, which was always the one that I found the most fascinating, and then Christ as a transformer of culture. And you, I think, make the claim that cultural apologetics takes the strengths and tries to avoid the weaknesses of each of those 5 views. And again, it's not against, the William Lane Craig approaches or the evidentialist apologetics approaches. It kind of takes that up into cultural apologetics as one of the influences. So it's a very holistic apologetic, I think. So we might summarize it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I'm trying to, like, you know, I'm a philosopher. I love to traffic in propositions, you know, in arguments for God and things like that, of course. But yeah, it's trying to locate that in like respect. What does it mean to be fully embodied human beings that not only are making culture but shaped by the culture that we make? And so there is a role for rational. You know, I've got a chart, as you know, in there. You know, there's a role for rational apologetics and moral apologetics and imaginative apologetics. I kind of carve out this new lane, you know, because why not, called cultural apologetics. But it really, to me, it's just like it takes all of that and sort of integrates it into what does it mean to be human, and then what does it mean to be humans that find themselves making and being shaped by culture. So yeah, we need to do all that. So I'm saying we have all these resources at our disposal: the rational, the imaginative, the moral, and more besides. Why don't we just use them all and think about how they fit together in such a way as to build a case that's more robust? So,
and you know, that's beautiful, and it had me thinking about, you know, when I talk to my students about mythos and logos as ancient Greek concepts, you know, prior to Plato. Although you could speak better to the Platonic side, I know Plato kind of wedged them apart a little bit more and emphasized more of the logos. But of course, we know, the allegory of the cave and you know, many other stories that Plato employed. But I think this is what I wanted to say is this: it's a truly mythological approach in that ancient sense of the word. It combines mythos and logos, which are, you know, viewers and listeners, you know, and if you know me, you know, I love these concepts. And that is, it engages the imaginative aspects of being human. It engages the rational aspect of being human, and it takes those together and delivers what Lewis called a partial solution to that tragic dilemma, you know, to either taste and not know, or to know and not taste. So I see that kind of fitting in nicely with cultural apologetics. And well, of course, we'll talk here in a few minutes about imagination and myth in particular, about how we can do that through story. And that will speak to the practical application for cultural apologetics. I also have a question for you about, you know, being at a secular school, and if you're working in public education, like, you know, public schools like my wife is, strategies, anything you could think of, any practical ways we can employ what you're talking about in this book would be great. But before we get into that, which will be the last leg of today, just so that I don't forget, to summarize disenchantment and re-enchantment, you quoted from an essay that I was not aware of until you put it in front of me. Again, this is ebook edition, page 43 is, I think, the first time you mentioned it. It's C.S. Lewis's essay. Is it Talking About Bicycles, I think?
Yeah, I think so.
Something like that,
right.
yeah. Something with bikes in it, yeah. So, you know, I mentioned this to my students recently. They're like, what? Is he a mechanic or something? And I'm like, no. Okay, so we'll talk about this. How does this essay figure into the disenchantment, re-enchantment framework that you've built?
Yeah, you know, it's so interesting, that essay, Talking About Bicycles, you can find it in a collection, a little book called On Present Concerns. That unlocked Lewis for me, actually. And I think it unlocked Tolkien for me. I know you're the Tolkien scholar, not me, but I think it definitely unlocked Lewis for me, in a way that I think opened up all of his other writings. But he basically is using a bicycle in this little essay. He wrote it for a periodical, like a newspaper, you know, in 1946. But he's using the bicycle to describe the four stages that we go through with pretty much respect to everything. And real briefly, those four stages are, he imagines like a little child coming into the world. Stage one, you know, surrounded by all these gadgets and they mean nothing to us. So we're unenchanted by them, basically. And then, you know, to use the bicycle as our metaphor or example, you can imagine that moment when you're, you know, I know you've got young children, right? Mine are a little older now, but that moment when they're learning how to ride their bike and suddenly the training wheels come off and you're running behind them, holding them, and then you let go. And they for the first time, you know, they ride that thing, and it's free, and it's you know, pure joy. It's like this is stage two. We become enchanted toward the bicycle, where everything is as it should be. There's joy and happiness, and, you know, freedom and all those things. But then he says that we pretty quickly, and if you think about your relationship to bikes and my relationship to bikes, this is pretty true. You know, we move to that third stage, because I had to ride my bike everywhere as a kid and I hated it. But, you know, disenchanted, where the bike becomes drudgery and work and, you know, just, it's not exciting. But Lewis says that pretty much we stay in this third stage with respect to everything. And he says we've got to press off this third stage onto the fourth stage, which is re-enchantment. And so for him, re-enchantment with respect to the bike would be learning to enjoy the bike in creaturely response. And that's where he's arguing we ought to go with everything. And so that four-stage sort of, unenchanted, enchanted, disenchanted, re-enchantment, I really think that unlocked a lot of what he's doing in his fiction and his nonfiction. So yeah, and it's kind of the mental metaphor that is behind much of what I'm writing about in the book.
Yeah, I can see so many different applications of this model for Tolkien, and just thinking on a level of kind of the lower way that theologians think about idols and idolatry. There was a time in my life, where I was so burned out from school and sports, and it was okay, video games, this is going to give me my joy, right? And it's, if anybody knows this from games, card games, board games, anything, any kind of commodity, you buy one, you're happy, you're enthused by it, this is the greatest thing in the world, and then you burn out and you're like, what is this? What is this thing? I have no desire to touch it ever again. Well, I'll go get something else. And then we do get stuck in that stage, and we think we're actually getting re-enchanted, but we never are. And this, of course, makes me think of Augustine and, our hearts are restless until we find their rest in you. And so many others that have commented on this, that we have to find the thing that is going to really satisfy us. And it also makes me think of that beautiful, I think it is theology, poetry, or maybe it's The Weight of Glory, but the longing came through them. It wasn't in the music, it wasn't in the poetry. We might add, it isn't in the game, it isn't in the story, but it's the longing that came through them. It points to Christ, is what we believe. So yeah, what a beautiful model. And so I'm grateful that you exposed me to that. Thank you.
Yeah,
it's a good one.
Discover it myself.
Yeah. Well, I hope our listeners and viewers get a copy. Was it On Present Concerns, you said, was the collection?
You can get it in a book, a collection. And there's a couple other essays in there that are worth the book as well. One on the empty universe. Again, same thing. Like, oh my gosh, this is exactly, this is disenchantment. So those two. He also has one called Living in an Atomic Age. I think it's in there. But there's a couple that are just.
The reason I ask you is that I've been on an ebook kick lately, and I noticed, I think it was HarperCollins or Harper One, but they've done repackaged ebook editions. And I think what I wanted to tell the audience is that they're very easy to find, and I've seen them on the bookshelf at Barnes and Noble too. There's all these new colorful reprints. Yeah, so easy to find. Check it out, or look it online so you can find what collection. I trust Paul's. So check out On Present Concerns. Okay, let's move forward from that, and our final stretch for today to talk about, do you have a working definition of how you understand mythos or myth in general and its usefulness for Christian apologetics, or not?
Yeah, I do actually. Okay. And so I printed it out knowing that you'd ask it, so I've got it right here with me. Can I share? So I just finished this book. I brought this too. It's called This Tender Lamb. I don't know if have you heard of this?
No.
William Kent Kruger, New York Times bestseller. Just finished it yesterday.
Okay.
But I have to read to you the first line because I was hooked, and it's related to your question.
Okay, perfect.
I was hooked from the first line. So let me just read it and I'll tell you why it's so cool. So he says, in the beginning, after he labored over the heavens and the earth, the light and the dark, the land and the sea, and all living things that dwell therein, after he created man and women, and before he rested, I believe God gave us one final gift. Lest we forget the divine source of all that beauty, he gave us stories. And I love that because he's showing the theological connection between, gift and story and beauty. And so anyway, just finished it. It's a modern retelling of Homer's Odyssey, actually, and kind of like Huck Finn at the same time. Like, it's really good. But that line just, I was sold, and it was a delightful tale.
I can see why.
Yeah. So, this is this gift to remind us of the beauty, the source of beauty itself, this final gift that he gives us before he rested his story. And that's such a key insight about the importance theologically of stories. So with that, I'll just give you my definition. And again, these are all working definitions, but Okay, let me just say a few things, and because I'm looking down at my notes, but
Yeah.
stories, I do think they study three related questions that are at every human heart, and those are the questions of where am I from, where am I going, where am I bound, and then how must we get there? And so these are the question of origin, quest, and destiny.
Yep.
And so the answers to those questions, I think, reveal, and this is again a key insight, whether we are pilgrims or wanderers in life, right? So the pilgrims are, we're, as people say, we're homo viators, again, to speak with the learned, right? The Latin, we're creatures on the way, and that's kind of the human condition. And how we live our life, I think, reveals whether we're pilgrims on a journey toward our true home, or we're just wandering about. And I think stories play a huge role, in answering and helping us think through those questions. So here's my little definition, tentative. A good story is a dramatic account that binds together ideas, events, images, and agents into an intelligible pattern in order to reveal deep truth about prime reality. So there's a little Tolkien in there if you've read your On Fairy Stories. But the big idea, I think, so they're ordered accounts that reflect the order and coherence of existence itself, right? That's what stories are. That's the idea there, pulling all these things together. They have a dramatic quality to them. And I think that's important because I believe that each of us was created for drama, right? We live this vicariously through others, but we're created to live this dramatic life. And I think stories remind us of that.
Yeah.
Of course, stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end, right?
Yep.
A beginning, usually some Elysium, some paradise. The middle is usually some conflict that sets us on a quest. And then the end is usually some sort of resolution. But the big idea, though, when thinking about this is that, and I love, this is one theologian named Urban Holmes. He says that stories reach toward theological understanding. That's why I think good stories do that. They reach toward theological understanding. They reach toward these sort of primordial beginnings of the universe, of our species, of our lives. I think they reach toward that sort of pilgrim's quest. And of course, I think they reach toward the end of all things, when all things will be known by their true name, when all things will be renewed, and so on. And so I think that's, the beauty of story. That's, I think, why we're so drawn to it, is because they're really reaching for these deep theological truths. So I'll stop there, but there's more.
Well, I don't want you to stop. That's great. I'll jump in for a second, but I'm trying to sneak in a few notes here. That was a great definition. I think, the succinct one that I provided in my book was a starting point for some other projects that I want to work on that goes in this direction. But, I'm kind of standing on Alistair McGrath's shoulders. Another way we might say this for people who are familiar with the concept of worldview, as I know many of our audience will be, is that a myth is a narrated or a plotted worldview, is it's a storied explanation. And Paul gave a much more aesthetic and I think eloquent one that appeals to the imagination and that hunger in the heart. So I loved what you said, and yet, so a narrated worldview might be another way of looking at it. The distinction you made between pilgrims and wanderers is great, and I know you drew on some Aristotle there with his Poetics, and of course, what he talks about, the plotted beginning, middle, and end, and we could tie that to what you say in your book about how Christians view the plot of creation, fall, redemption, restoration. Which is, the typical way of breaking it down. So it's great. And yeah, that is a huge difference between pilgrims and wanderers. We know that there's a destination in the former, there's not. It's kind of the existentialist universe, I think, of Camus, with the soul of the wanderer. So I love that. I guess I'd never heard it that way. So thank you. That was great. And lurking in there, I know I got your primary world reference, primary reality on fairy stories. Of course, I'd get it. It's great. Tolkien, of course, was speaking of the world that we live in that, and the secondary realm is the world of story. But what he was getting at, of course, is by going into the secondary reality or story, we come back into the primary and things are re-enchanted. And that's the whole point, isn't it? And Lewis in Voyage of the Dawn Treader, I think, has Aslan say something very similar at the end of the book. By spending a little time here, you get to know me in that world better. Something to that extent when they're on the beach, I think. It's I think after Reepicheep or before he goes off. Anyway, that's great. And of course, the thing that ties into this, and you kind of hinted at it, is the role of the imagination and its role in myth. So for our last topic, maybe speak to the looking at versus looking along, which I know is also you drawing on Lewis's meditation in a tool shed, looking at imagination versus looking along, and we'll tie this together with myth, and then I think that'll be our last subject.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, you're right. So looking at versus looking along is a great metaphor from Lewis. Finding God in the Dock, meditations on a tool shed, in a tool shed. Looking at is just, as a philosopher, I think it's this idea of like, we want to define and understand the thing we're talking about. So let's look deeply at the faculty of the imagination and try to define that. And so I do that in the book. I canvas. I mean, there's a lot of surprise. There's been a lot of literature over the centuries on what is the imagination. Aristotle, Plato all have important things to say. Kant, some of the poets in the Romantic era had important things to say. Coleridge, of course, being one of the chief ones. And of course, Lewis and Tolkien both have very important and well-informed theologies of the imagination. And then, of course, that Jamie K. Smith is tapping into some of that in a different function with the imagination. I do, in terms of what is the imagination, I mean, I do give a definition in the book, and it's something like a faculty or power of the mind to do us, that helps us do certain things. It connects finite spirits to infinite spirits. It's mediates between sense and reason, and then it's it's for invention and for understanding, or something like that. But I've always just loved Lewis's quick, pithy, as always, definition of the imagination as the organ of meaning. I'm sure you've talked about that or had people on that talk about that. I think that's so helpful. It's that which helps us understand the world around us, right? So we're delivered, for Lewis, our sensation is raw, and we perceive things, and then we deliver that to the imagination for understanding, and then we deliver that to to our minds, our reasoning faculties, to judge as true and false, and then we deliver that, our true judgments, to our will to act.
Exactly. Yes.
And then so that was the kind of at. And then in terms of the looking along piece, it's like, how do we use the imagination to awaken these longings, these deep longings for truth, goodness, and beauty? I love Peter Craiff, this awesome Catholic philosopher, who in his book, Back to Virtue, this is one of the other metaphors that pulled the book together for me, pulled the book I wrote together, was he has this chart about, these three, I think he calls them three prophets of the soul that are on a quest for the object of their longing that God has given each of us. He's given us a reason on a quest for truth. He's given us a conscience on the quest for goodness. And of course, he's given us an imagination on a quest for beauty. And then if we put our theology caps on and ask, what is the source of goodness, truth, and beauty? The answer is Christ. And I've always loved this line in Augustine, book 3, where he speaks of God. He says, "You are the beauty of all beautiful things." Lewis picks that up, of course, in The Weight of Glory, like you referenced. The beauty of all beautiful things and the good of all good things. And I would just add the truth in which all true things point. So we use our imagination to walk that plank of beauty, to set people on a journey that has as its terminus the divine source of beauty itself. And that's why we use the aesthetic currency of the day: story, art, beauty, paintings, drawings, poems, poetry, whatever, to awaken longings and set people on a journey. And that's, I'll stop there, but that's
it's so great. I know, with all podcasts, we're working with limited time, but you're on a roll here. So I just want to nudge you in the direction. I'll say something about myth here, how I think it kind of comes alongside what you said, but we'll talk about that question about application of cultural apologetics. And then I have that question from my wife, who's in public education. I know there are a lot of Christian public educators who are in, especially the public schools, and I know there's private schools that are Christian, so it's a little different. But what we can do as Christians to share the gospel, if you do any tips about schools in particular. But before that, and some other practical tips, perhaps, I'd just say that I think I learned this from Dr. Starr, who put it in this way. He was on the show, I think, for episode 4. He says something like this. He says that myth bypasses the cognitive space between reason and imagination, which you hinted at in your explanation. And I liked also Michael Ward, who you quoted in your book, who talked about the basement and the sensations, and your whole explanation there. That was very helpful. It's great visual, kind of making the point that our imagination apprehends that image of the house with the basement and the first floor and the second floor. And then we're instantly able to understand how all these reason, imagination, the senses all work in tandem. But he says, again, Starr says, myth bypasses the cognitive space between reason and imagination And I think he's drawing on Lewis again here, between knowing and not tasting, and tasting and not knowing, and tries to give us something like a unitive experience. And then in his Fawn's Bookshelf, which is an excellent book, by the way, he says it gives us a glimpse of the heavenly landscape. And you mentioned earlier how reality ought to be. And, I touch on this in my book about on fairy stories, and Star touches on it, and you touch on it. And we're all kind of honing in on this. I love that phrase, heavenly landscape. It gives us a glimpse of that. So I think myth is a perfect vehicle to kind of get in there right in between, to give a person an experience of the both and, the logos, the mythos, the rational hunger, the imaginative longing that speaks to the conscience as well. Let's not forget ethics, and our moral imagination is very important. So I think that's a great way to say what Lewis said, the blending together of reason and romance. That's what myth is.
Yeah, that's
So,
great. Yeah,
yeah.
just final, just to put a bow on that.
Yeah.
I think Tim Keller even says this. He's got this great little essay on, which I interact with in the book. But like, why do we need artists? Well, because they help pull back that curtain and sort of peer at reality as it really is. And I think that's the beauty of stories too. It allows us to have a kind of lived experience, of a secondary world, right? But actually that secondary world might be pointing to something really true. That's why here's my definition of a good story. I think that these good stories are actually pointing to prime reality in a way that, as Lewis would put it, running around those watchful dragons. It's really what the heart longs for. And that's why, going back to earlier, we talked about how our longings betray us, right? Just because this is what we long for. This is actually what we're on a journey for, whether we're wanderers or pilgrims. Heart longs for, we've been created to be nourished on the good and the true and the beautiful, right? That's how we've been made. And as so many people have pointed out, we're narratival animals, right? We're storytelling animals. Last thing I'll say, for those who are interested in the theology of story, I know you are too, the book that I found super helpful on this is actually by a not known Catholic theologian. I think he teaches in Rome, called John Navone. And I think it's called Seeking God in the Story or something like that. But Google John Navone, unbelievable theology of story book. So if you're interested in this, read it. He's, and a lot of he talks a lot about how I talked about the three parts, the three questions that stories do. Navone.
I've written it down. That's great. Yeah, and some of my background as a Catholic, so I always love reading the Catholic scholars, and Kreeft is one of my favorites as well. You mentioned, to check it out. So before the practical question too, just for anybody wondering, we were going to talk about myth as indirect communication too, but I want to say perhaps Paul will come back on the show again, or both, that we'll do that, and I want to do something on indirect communication and the role that myth as indirect communication, as you said, sneaking around those watchful dragons. And sometimes that's what we need, because it's we're guarded against hearing something. So we need to kind of approach something differently. So just as a word of comfort and encouragement for Christians out there working in mission or apologetics in both, or as educators in public school systems, you may need to find a way to get creative and to point to cultural artifacts. And that'll be my segue into, we all have these shared cultural artifacts, popular culture. And so what can we do as teachers, police officers, engineers, nurses, doctors, all of the things that we do? What can we do to employ cultural apologetics, maybe particularly educators? Some final words on that. Any advice?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I spent a lot of time talking to professors about these things, and they ask a similar question, how do we do that? And in some ways it's super easy, and then it's super hard. Like Lewis says, Christianity, it's the easiest thing and the hardest thing. Well, same here.
Exactly.
Because if you think about it, if you think about the set of all human longings as think about that set and then put it as like an inverted triangle. Like at the base, you have the deepest desire of the human heart, what Augustine would put, the longing for God. Our hearts are restless until they find rest in there. Lewis, of course, being a classic scholar, was aware of Augustine and all of them. But right above that deepest desire, if you think again about that inverted triangle, are all the deep longings of the human heart. And right there, I would put our longing for goodness, truth, beauty, justice, happiness, everything else. Right above that deep longing, right? Because the source of it all is God. So what we're doing as educators is we're awake. So what we can do, how can we join with God and even do this here, is we can awaken longing. Like if you teach geography, or geology, teach them truth. And in awakening that longing for truth, you set them on a journey that has as its terminus the source of truth, which is God. And so what we can do as educators is awaken their longing, not just for truth, but for goodness and beauty besides, I think. By in the teaching that we do it with beauty in mind. Of course, we do it, walk that plank of truth. We're seeking truth, and in awakening longings, connecting them to the good, the true, and the beautiful. I think we can set them on a journey, just as you mentioned earlier. Lewis was prepared through the things that he read for the gospel when he met it, right? The real thing. And as educators, we can do that by awakening the deep longings for goodness, truth, and beauty. So eventually they can discover that all finds its source in God.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, I think that'll be a great encouragement to educators, and we'll have to talk more about the subject another time. I know we've kept you on here for an hour, so thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate having you.
Absolutely. So good to be here, Mike. I'm happy to come back on, but really excited for you and your ministry and your book with Tolkien and things like that. So thanks for the time.
Our pleasure. Thank you. All right.